Hello, everyone, and welcome to our what I hope will be an exciting session today. I'd like to start by thanking COP26 for organizing this program and providing us this space in these facilities. Our speakers here today will be joining us, and I know that you will be joining us live. You will be joining us virtually, excuse me. So my name is Carl Elefante. I'm a senior fellow with Architecture 2030. Architecture 2030 is dedicated to rapidly decarbonizing the built environment through transformative policies and building sector leadership. There we go. All right. Sorry, I'm getting the hang of the clicker here. So I'm honored to welcome you all to this event, 65% by 2030, 0 by 2040. Top 200 global firms and organizations lead with 1.5 degrees Celsius climate action. For those of you watching online, you can join the conversation using the hashtag COP26 Communiqué. And this event has been organized by Architecture 2030 in partnership with ASHRAE, represented here today by Ginger Scogans, who's at my left here. Joining me here at COP26 are also Peter Exley with the American Institute of Architects, Alan Valance with the Royal Institute of British Architects, Carolyn Pidgeon with the Australian Institute of Architects that around the American Institute of Architects is known as the other AIA. I'm sure that works both ways. And Kachikornvarakom with the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Today we'll be hearing from these leading professional associations representing the architectural, design, and engineering community about the actions their organizations are taking to reduce carbon emissions from the built environment to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Throughout this conference, I've heard many government and industry officials continue to promote 2050 as the target year for eliminating carbon emissions. The best and most recent science on global warming makes it terribly clear that 2050 is not soon enough to keep the world under the 1.5 degree warming cap. The just released IPCC report is conclusive. We need to rapidly decarbonize and fully eliminate emissions from all sectors by 2040 to have the best chance at meeting the 1.5 degree goal. The UN Environment Program data makes it clear that the building sector is a major contributor to global carbon emissions. It is an imperative that changes are made in the way we design, construct, and operate buildings to reach the 2040 target. The good news is that the building sector is already taking bold action to reduce carbon emissions. We'll hear about this in detail from Ed Mazzaria in just a moment, the founder of Architecture 2030, whose presentation is next. But to stay within the 2040 target, the building sector and we building professionals need to dig even deeper, and we need our partners in government, finance, and industry too to dig deeper. This is why over 70 of the world's largest and most influential architectural firms and building industry organizations have come together to sign on to the COP26 Communiqué, a call to action to government leaders to step up their commitments and to reduce carbon emissions to meet the 1.5 carbon budget. Signatories of the Communiqué are responsible for more than $300 billion in global construction annually and represent over 1 million building industry professionals. We are lucky to have with us today representatives from some of the biggest and most influential industry players. We hope to leave this event today both inspired and motivated to call on governments and demand that they commit to total decarbonization by 2040. Anything less is unacceptable. To elaborate further the urgency of the 2040 goal, we will next have a presentation from Ed Mazzaria, CEO and co-founder of Architecture 2030. I think everyone with me here today would agree that our association's commitments to climate action would not be what they are without the decades of leadership, encouragement, and assistance from Ed and Architecture 2030. I am delighted to say that Ed was awarded the AIA Gold Medal this very year for his, quote, unwavering voice and leadership, end quote, in the fight against climate change. Without further ado, here's Ed's presentation.
If we move forward together, we can keep 1.5 degrees C alive. But there's an old saying in the US, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And we don't want to end up someplace else. So how do we meet the 1.5? Well, the IPCC put out its 2021 report, and this is the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees C for keeping global average temperature at that rise above pre-industrial levels. We can see that to have a good probability of meeting the 1.5, our carbon budget is from 300 to 400 gigatons of CO2. That's how much we can put into the atmosphere. So what does that mean? Well, we're now putting in about 40 gigatons of CO2 a year. This year we'll put in slightly less. But if we look at many of the pledges that are being made to phase out CO2 emissions by 2050, if we follow a straight line down, that's 600 gigatons. That's way over the 300 to 400 gigatons. That's our carbon budget, our 1.5 degrees C carbon budget. So that doesn't work. That's too much. So how do we meet the 1.5? Well, many scientists and countries and organizations are calling for a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by the year 2030. If we follow that line down and we meet that target, we keep doing what we've been doing to meet that target, then we will phase out CO2 emissions by the year 2040, and that's 400 gigatons. That gives us a 67% chance of meeting the 1.5. And to have an even better chance, if we get to a 65% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 and then phase out by 2040, that'll be 340 gigatons, and that'll give us over a 67% chance. So a 50 to 65% reduction between now and 2030 and a phase out by 2040 gives us a high probability of meeting the 1.5. So what does that mean? Well, this is how we see all emissions, how it's presented usually. Building operations, 27%, this is global. Industry, 43%, transportation, another 23%. However, this is a little misleading because buildings is responsible for 10% of all global emissions, and the infrastructure that goes along with buildings and the other construction, such as roads and site work, things like that, and even interiors, that's under other construction, that's another 10%. So you could see that the built environment is responsible for close to half of all global emissions. So how does the world change? It's interesting to look historically to see how we can do it and what the time frame is for doing that today. This was late 1800s. This is a pre-industrial city, just about the time of the Industrial Revolution getting started. And you can see that buildings are not tall, 3 stories maximum you could walk up, and all masonry buildings, very small spaces and small windows. So how did we get from there to this today? This is Toronto today. You can see skyscrapers with lots and lots of glass, all glass facades. How did we go from pre-industrial times to modern buildings? Well, the first modern building was the Bauhaus. That's considered the first modern building. And here you can see structure moves inside the building. We don't have bearing masonry walls anymore. We have columns, pinpoint loads, and beams and slabs. So we can open up the floor plan and hang the exterior wall off the structure, so we can make it all glass. Then we can get light into spaces. So that was 1925. So what was going on in 1925? Things were pretty primitive. When the first modern building was done, there was the Model T truck. We didn't have television. We couldn't make transatlantic calls, for example. So things were pretty primitive. And back then, with the Industrial Revolution starting in the early 1900s, conditions were really bad, and the architecture and planning community got together to address those conditions. People were dying at emphysema. Coal was being burned right in the middle of housing developments in cities. So they got together and said, this is untenable. And they set out kind of utopian environmental reform principles: function-based zones, get the housing out of the industrial areas, make them high-rise housing blocks, use all that glass to get solar exposure, open up the floor plan. Le Corbusier developed his 5 points toward this new architecture, which was a column wall separation. So you had columns, so you could free up the facade design and use horizontal windows and lots of glass and free up the plan. So this was the beginnings of the modern movement, and they laid out these principles. That was in 1928. By 1932, those principles and modern architecture came to the US in a big exhibit in 1932 at the Museum of Modern Art, and they called it the International Style. We can now take what was going on in Europe and bring it to the US and recreate it here. By 1939, we had the Johnson wax building. You can see a big open floor space with pinpoint columns, beautiful, beautiful space. And by 49, you had the Glass House by Philip Johnson as a statement. This was a single glass, all glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut, a very cold climate. Because fossil fuels were cheap, we could climate control any interior environment. And we were often running and developing high-rise, single glass, all glass buildings, because we can climate control them. And energy was very, very inexpensive. By 56, we had entire cities based on the modern planning of the modern movement. So how long did it take to go from the Bauhaus, which was the first building, and the Congress of Modern Architecture, the development of it, all the way to the Lever House? From the Bauhaus to the Lever House took 27 years. That's it. And we did all of that. We changed the world with those design principles and those designs with primitive tools. The only thing we had back then was T-squares and triangles and pens that we had to dip in inkwell. It took years to do one set of construction documents, and we can only do really roughly rectangular buildings because we couldn't dimension a curve and get it built. We didn't get the first ink pen till 1960 and the first laptop computer till 1991. So we changed the world in 27 years with primitive, really primitive materials and tools at our disposal. We now have 20 years, 10 years to get to that 50 to 65% reduction, and then another 10 years to phase out all carbon emissions by the year 2040. Now, at COP, we've issued a communique, and we're asking the countries to pledge to get to a 50 to 65% reduction by 2030. If they do that, then they'll be on track for a zero CO2 emissions by the year 2040, and we can meet the 1.5. So the largest professional organizations in the world, representing over 1 million people, have signed on to this pledge and will work to meet the 50 to 65% reduction by the year 2030, zero by 2040, and are calling upon governments to do the same. Also signed on to the communique are over 60 of the largest architecture, engineering, and planning landscape architecture firms in the world, responsible for over $300 billion in annual construction, pledging to help the countries and get the built environment down to these targets. So what are the guiding principles that we're setting out today for the built environment to make this change happen? Well, for new buildings and renovations, we're calling for all new buildings to be designed zero carbon today. That means no on-site fossil fuels. We do that by designing efficient buildings, electrifying them, and using renewable energy for that electricity, either on-site, mostly on-site if we can do it, and then bring it in off-site for whatever else we need. And we're asking cities and jurisdictions to implement zero codes, because we have zero carbon codes today. And if they implement them, then all new buildings will be zero carbon. What about all the materials and construction to build all these new buildings that we're going to build between now and 2040? Well, we're calling for carbon reductions, embodied carbon reductions in steel and concrete of 50% by 2025, and then zeroing out carbon emissions in steel and concrete by the year 2030, and then whole buildings zero by 2040, 50% by 2030. Why single out steel and concrete? Because steel and concrete are responsible for half of almost all industrial sector emissions. That's everything that's made. Just two materials are responsible for half. And so we start with those two materials, we can get very large reductions very, very quickly. So what about all those existing buildings out there? Well, we know that a very small number of large buildings in cities all around the world, 5% or less than the total number of buildings in the city, are responsible for about half of a city's building sector emissions. And then the rest, the other 95% or more of buildings, are responsible for the other 50% of building sector emissions. So we developed a two-part strategy for getting all buildings to zero. First, big buildings. Start with big buildings. Mandate that they must get to zero carbon by 2030. It's not that difficult. They just get rid of on-site fossil fuels, electrify, and use on-site or off-site renewables to produce that electricity. And we're asking for local jurisdictions to pass policies and ordinances and mandates for that to happen with all big buildings. There are just not that many of them, and it's easy to get them under control. And usually with the very big buildings, the people who own the big buildings and companies who own the big buildings have the wherewithal to do it. And then for the small buildings, we give them out to 2040. Again, electrify and use renewables, and do it at intervention points, at places, at times when these small buildings are going to be renovated, at point of sale, when they undergo a renovation, when equipment gets old and it has to be replaced. Then we electrify and use renewables, and we're asking for policies and incentives for building owners to do that. That's how we get the building sector to zero carbon by the year 2040, the built environment by the year 2040. So this is what the timeline looks like. We're issuing the communique today at the COP in Glasgow, calling for all new buildings to be zero carbon immediately. And then work toward reducing the embodied carbon of carbon and steel, so that by 2025, we get a 50% embodied carbon reduction in concrete and steel. And then by 2030, we phase out embodied carbon in carbon and steel. So it'd be essentially clean materials. And we have alternatives that we can use now if concrete and steel does not meet these targets. We have mass timber, cross-laminated timber, glue-laminated timber. Bamboo is now starting to become a material, and there's all sorts of other materials that are very low carbon. We're also saying that by 2030, big buildings need to be zero carbon in building operations. And then out to 2040, all materials for all buildings need to be really zero carbon. And by that time, then we get the small buildings to zero carbon building operations. That's how we transform the entire built environment between now and 2040. And we're getting quite a bit of help. Solar is now the cheapest electricity in history. And that was starting last year. And we have all the tools that we need to get this done very, very quickly. We can design buildings very, very quickly, get the drawings done and get them built and renovated. So how are we doing? Let's take a look at the US. This is traditional. Traditionally, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, not even 1995, as floor area increased, so did energy consumption of the building sector, and so did CO2 emissions, because all fuels were essentially fossil fuels. So as you built more buildings, you had increases in energy consumption and CO2 emissions. But something happened in 2005. From 2005 to 2020, floor area increased. We kept building. We actually added 53 billion square feet to our building stock in the United States. But look what happened to energy consumption. Energy consumption flattened out and actually went down slightly. So it didn't keep up with floor area. We were building, but not using any more building operations energy. That's because buildings coming in were being more efficient and we were renovating buildings down. But look at the drop in CO2 emissions. So as we kept building and renovating, we also kept using cleaner and cleaner fuels. And this last few years, we've been using mostly renewables, switching to mostly renewables. And so we're now in the US, we have a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions in the entire building sector in the US, even though we've added 53 billion square feet to our building stock. This decoupling of growing building floor area, growing, and emissions reducing is unprecedented in US modern history, and it illustrates that it can be done and it can be done quickly. So this is what we're projecting for the US. We're down 30% now from 2005 levels. Our administration wants to clean up the grid by 2035. If we do that and provide some incentives, which they've just done for energy efficiency and electrification, we expect the building sector in the US to reduce its building operations emissions by 72% from the year 2005 by the year 2030, and then get to zero emissions easily by the year 2040. So how are we doing globally? Well, worldwide, since 2010, the last decade, we've added 22% to our building floor, a huge amount of floor area worldwide. This is energy use. Energy use has not gone up as fast. So we're beginning to see a decoupling of energy use. In fact, in the last year, because of COVID, it's gone down slightly, 1%. But we see a flattening out in 2018 and then this slight reduction. So we're beginning to see this happen. What happened in the US over the last 15 years is beginning to happen globally. And here we see emissions, and this is very promising. We can see this decoupling of emissions and floor area taking place. And in the last year, it's happened because we switched almost exclusively to renewables. And this just out in 2020, this past year, where we see that major drop, renewable power was the only energy source for which demand increased while consumption of all other fuels declined. And that's responsible for this huge decline in emissions in the global building sector over this past year during COVID. We've got to keep that up. So We've issued the COP26 Communiqué. We're calling for a 50 to 65% reduction by 2030. That puts us on track for zero by 2040. We're ready, and we are already walking the talk, so they say. And if we move forward together, we can easily keep the 1.5 degrees C alive in our sector. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. Once again, crystal clear and inspiring. Now let's hear from the panel that's here with me today in the room. So just to repeat the introductions, I have here representatives of the leading professional associations from around the world who have signed on to the COP26 1.5 degrees Celsius communique, and they're going to share their insights into really why they decided to sign on to this challenge and the steps their organizations are taking to reduce emissions in the built environment. So as I mentioned before, the other panelists here with me today will hear in the following order. So Ginger Scoggins, who's the treasurer from ASHRAE, is here with us. Alan Vance, who's the CEO of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Carolyn Pidgeon, who's a member of the Climate Action and Sustainability Task Force Group and chair of the Environmental Design Guide Advisory Group of the Australian Institute of Architects. And Kachikornvarakom, chair of the Climate Working Group at the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Lastly, I'm going to put on a different hat and talk about my engagement with the Climate Heritage Network and why Climate Heritage Network signed on to the communique. So first up is Ginger. Ginger, tell us about ASHRAE and what you're doing.
Sure, Carl, thank you. So I'm Ginger Scoggins, treasurer of ASHRAE, and I'm delighted and honored to be here today on behalf of the over 50,000 ASHRAE members from over 132 nations dedicated to advancing the art and sciences of heating, ventilating, and air conditioning and refrigeration in the design and construction industry. The members of ASHRAE have focused on improving technology, advancing design, construction, and operation of building systems, and developing standards, technical resources, and training for building professionals. For most of us, and that would include myself, we are not comfortable being activists or engaging with political movements, but that's not why we are here. Instead, ASHRAE signed on to the Building COP26 Communiqué, and we are here today because the members of ASHRAE involved with the HVAC&R and building systems have been and will continue to be advancing solutions to address climate change. We are here because we recognize that the built environment is one of the largest sources of the world's carbon emissions. And with the building stock continuing to expand and doubling by 2050, solutions from the building community is even more crucial. ASHRAE's flagship energy conservation standard 90.1 is the benchmark for commercial building energy codes in the United States and has been a key basis for codes and standards around the world for more than 45 years, reducing energy consumption by 50%. Reducing energy reduces carbon. And yet only 38 countries have specifically named building standards and codes in their nationally determined contributions. Many of the countries where the building stock is expected to grow the most do not require energy standards for buildings. And that is where ASHRAE and our over 50,000 professionals around the world can help. ASHRAE's building standards, guidelines, and education and training courses can tackle energy consumption and thereby carbon reduction in buildings and get us to net zero. And this can be done cost effectively with off-the-shelf technology. We just demonstrated this capability at our newly retrofitted ASHRAE headquarters in Georgia, taking a 1970s era building and transforming it to a net zero energy building. As part of this renovation, we installed a 330 kW DC solar photovoltaic array to offset our energy usage at our headquarters. The estimated production of this system will be over 457 kilowatts per hour per year. Pending verification of the performance of this system in the next year, we are expected to be net zero. This project is a demonstration project of what is possible with older building stock, and all performance metrics of our system and our photovoltaic system will be available on our website for public consumption. This project can be replicated globally, and it can be done with new construction, through retrofitting existing buildings, and through operational performance of buildings that are not being retrofitted. The HVAC design engineers, scientists, and building professionals at ASHRAE are up to the challenge to tackle emissions from buildings and to advance zero energy and zero carbon building design. ASHRAE signed the building industry's Communiqué, and we are ready to help policymakers and the buildings industry around the world transform our building stock into one that is sustainable, resilient, and healthy. We are here to be part of the solution, and we are up to the challenge. Thank you, Carl.
Well, thank you, Ginger. You know how valuable your partnership has been in the development of these energy standards. We absolutely wouldn't be where we are today without all the work that ASHRAE has done for a very long time now. Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good to have you here. Next up is Peter Exley, FAIA, the 2021 president of the American Institute of Architects. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carl, and good day. I'm Peter Exley, and I'm president of the American Institute of Architects, the world's largest organization dedicated to design. I'm delighted to be here today with my colleagues who represent our most notable and venerated partners. My colleagues at ASHRAE, of course, and Architecture 2030, amongst others. When the AIA honored Architecture 2030's founder Ed Masria this year, it was in recognition for his tireless advocacy on behalf of the environment that we all share, and for the climate action that requires our full commitment. As Masria and others have been saying for decades, it is not enough to merely raise the possibility of action. We must take action. One of the most important ways we can think about architecture's agency in the fight for equality is zero carbon design, which is an ethical approach to human-centered action and planet-centered action. Some architecture firms have wisely made climate action a success metric for every single project they take on. Some have signed the 2030 commitment the American Institute of Architects maintains in partnership with Architecture 2030. Several of the world's largest AEC organizations join me here today. Their participation at COP26 this week is a testament to their commitment to a healthier planet and what I call a design ethic. Their follow-through is critical for our collective success, and if they can create pathways, supply streams, methods of construction, and industry standards, then every community we live in may benefit from their contribution. Our collective success is a matter of commitment and a matter of scale. My alma mater, Newcastle University, has delegates here at COP. And if my regional university in the north of England has a stake in this, you better believe that we all do. Why? Because if it's just the giants of industry, we will never get to 100% reduction in carbon emissions. We need everyone. The giants of industry must work twice as hard so that the small architecture firms, like mine, can have twice the opportunity to align our practices. No one is too big to fail when we've all failed to heed the call to action. No one is too small to make a difference, either, to quote Greta Thunberg. As you know, we all exist on a continuum of agency where the big and small have a role. That continuum extends in time too, where the billionaires of the world and a first-year architecture student have roles to play. There's been a significant investment among certain schools of architecture to meet the challenges of climate action. There must be more investment in revamping curricula, in technology, in materials, in time, and in an effort to retain talented faculty across the disciplinary spectrum, from ethics to business, to sustainable biomaterials. I believe that every single architecture grad today should have the tools to understand how to create zero carbon buildings. I believe this is the most important pivot in architectural education we've ever contemplated, far more consequential than Beaux-Arts or Bauhaus pedagogies, or scuttling a pencil in favor of a mouse. A climate and equity-based curriculum is critical to our future as a profession and as a planet. That goes for architecture schools. I believe it also goes for all schools. We must work with schools of government and policy. We must work with engineers. Architects have happily allied ourselves with business schools, but the call to action is much bigger and much louder than the so-called triple bottom line. It is a call to action through the ages. My generation and others must look beyond monetizing an opportunity to build green. To them, to us, I will say that this is an existential crisis and we need to do better. We need to treat the Greta Thunbergs of the world as more than just a voice. Theirs is a generation that is prepared to take action embodied by Greta. We need to mobilize a generation of Gretas and give them the resources and the education so that there's some warranty to the promises we make here at COP26. I'll close by honoring Ed Masria, who committed himself to action, education, and an evidence-based approach to carbon neutrality. It must sound peculiar to everyday people outside this room that we can all contribute to eliminating carbon emissions. They think, do they want me to sell my car? Do they want me to stop buying things that must be shipped to my house? Do they want me to stop using plastics? I'm comfortable enough being uncomfortable to say that I would also find it extremely hard, as Peter Exley, the civilian, to do such things. I think the message is that we can all do these things. As Peter Exley, the architect, I can adapt to the call to action in everything I do. I can design net zero spaces and buildings. I can responsibly and ethically source materials. I can holistically think about water management and microclimates. I can embody a design ethic just as Greta Thunberg embodies a movement. As Peter the architect, I started 2020 thinking about architects as first adapters, architects as indispensable partners whenever health and well-being must be balanced by delight and inspiration in the places where we live our lives. However, unless we're at the proverbial table for the critical discussions about codes, zoning, material pipelines, land use, evaluating carbon taxes, creating carbon sinks, circular economies, and so much more, unless we're at the table for those discussions, then architects have abjured their agency. Again, I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues from the RIBA, IFLA, Climate Heritage Network, my colleagues at ASHRAE, and especially my colleagues from Architecture 2030. To them and to you, I say that it's up to us to be true agents of climate action. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate that, and I'm so proud to see AIA so deeply committed to climate action. It's been years in the making. There's been years of leadership that AIA has provided, and it's clear that AIA is in a position to continue along those lines. Very happy about it and really happy to see the acceleration. Next, we're going to hear from Alan Valance, the Chief Executive of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Many of us here in the room attended the pre-COP Built Environment Summit in London just 2 weeks ago that helped us be prepared for being here at this event. So Alan, thank you for doing that. We needed a little boost. So Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl, and hello everybody. It's great to be here. The RIBA is a professional membership body. We promote excellence in architecture, and we represent our members who live and work in over 115 countries right around the globe, from the UK all the way through to some of the low-lying islands in the Pacific, directly at threat from rising sea levels now. Climate is a global phenomenon, climate change a global challenge, so it's very fitting that I'm here with colleagues from right around the world, banding together to rise up and to face that challenge together. In a former role, I used to be the deputy head of the Australian Weather Bureau. right on the front line with scientists facing up to the climate challenge, dealing with bushfires, floods, plagues of locusts even, and tsunamis all at the same time. In 2010, I visited Cape Grim, which is on the remote northwest coast in Tasmania. The air there is amongst the cleanest anywhere on the Earth, and it's home to the Weather Bureau's facility, which is one of a very small number of baseline atmospheric pollution monitoring stations. Cape Grim monitors in real time the level of gases, carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. When I visited, the carbon measure read 386 parts per million. In August 2021, just over a decade later, that figure is up to 412 parts per million. And every single measurement during that time has been higher than the previous one. The link between rising man-made greenhouse gas emissions and climate change acceleration is clear. It was on a dial right in front of me. I could see it. We know that global temperatures are going to rise by more than 1.5% this century, 1.5 degrees centigrade this century, unless we reduce massively the amount of emissions. We all know that the built environment is responsible for some 40% of those emissions. So we know that we've all got a pivotal role to play in reducing those emissions. The case for action is clear. So if we know all that, what are we going to do about it? When? How? What's the part we're all going to play in our professions, our institutes, and our organisations? In September, the RIBA published our Built for the Environment report, which was produced in partnership with Architects Declare, a network of practices in the United Kingdom. The report considers how the built environment community can, indeed must, rapidly scale up capabilities and become a truly transformative force in reaching net zero. It shows how the built environment can operate within planetary limits, and it calls on the entire sector and also the governments and the regulators, policymakers who regulate it, to ensure their actions reflect the severity of the situation we all face. Our report points out the current lack of specific mitigation policies for the built environment. In many parts of the world, building codes don't exist at all. Where they do exist, they leave out significant emission sources such as embodied carbon. As the electricity in the gas grid continues to decarbonise, the embodied carbon emissions of most new buildings created between now and 2050 will be greater than the operational carbon emissions released through energy use during the building's entire lifetime. But in spite of this fact, embodied carbon is almost entirely unregulated. Current regulation focuses almost exclusively on the predicted energy use of new buildings, but disappointingly makes no attempt to regulate the building's actual energy use. Focusing on predicted energy consumption allows the sector to continue to rely on unverified data. Without data, our sector will unknowingly continue to make the same mistakes, wasting time and money and damaging the environment. We've got to address that through things like greater uptake of post-occupancy evaluation processes and other techniques. We've also got to prioritise the retrofitting and reuse of existing buildings wherever possible. This is the key to preserving and minimising existing embodied carbon. Governments can help to encourage the reuse and adaptation of existing buildings by collecting, storing and sharing information on derelict and vacant buildings. Alongside effective regulations, we also need to transform the policies that affect planning systems and enhance public procurement procedures. Government should revise planning systems to prioritise participatory planning and community engagement, whilst also ensuring that planning authorities have adequate local resources and expertise to gain both economic and sustainability benefits. Procurement processes should better consider social value. Contracts should be awarded on criteria such as health and well-being, access and inclusion, social sustainability, innovation and resilience, not merely the lowest cost. In 2019, to help our members respond to the climate emergency, the RIBA launched the 2030 Climate Challenge, an invitation to our architect members, architects more broadly, and the wider industry to shift towards outcomes-focused performance targets for practices to adopt in order to reduce operational energy, embodied carbon, and potable water usage. Achieving these targets will radically transform the built environment. And to support delivering on these targets, the RIBA also produced a series of sustainability guidance documents. In 2020, we revised the RIBA's plan of work to encourage consideration of sustainable design at each work stage in a project. To ensure projects are aligned with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, we've produced our Sustainable Outcomes Guide. Most recently, we've created the Plan for Use Guide, which sets out actions to deliver a sustainable built environment based on evidence, data, and lessons learned. Architects play the leading role in designing net zero buildings, places, and communities. But they can't do this alone because the built environment is a system. The transition to a fair and sustainable built environment can only be brought about through collaboration and through strategic system-wide analysis and action. Other sectors, such as the natural environment, have used systems models for decades to better understand issues and interdependencies. Weather agencies use Earth systems models to understand, predict climate and weather patterns. We've got to take this knowledge, these techniques, and apply them to the built environment to deliver science to impact risk-based decision-making, using big data to develop insight for significant change. We've got to shift towards interdisciplinary education and practice, commit to reporting successes and sharing lessons learned, and constantly challenge current methods and approaches to align with sustainable goals. As a sector, we've got the tools, we've got the knowledge, we've got the technology and the commitment to address the climate and the biodiversity emergency. The challenge is to deploy them and to do so at speed and with scale. We won't get to net zero without changing the way we design and construct buildings. But we've got to take warm words and put them into cold, hard action now, or face the warming consequences. And Carl, that's why the RIBA is right behind the COP26 Communiqué.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. And the report that you issued at the summit is very impressive work and really provides key roadmap for the way forward. Really appreciate all the contributions that are coming from RIBA in this. Next, we'll hear from the Australian Institute of Architects. Carolyn Pidgeon is up next. Carolyn?
Hello, and thank you very much for including me at late notice in this panel, only recently allowed out of the country. And I'm just really, really heartened to hear from the panel members about the fantastic work that RIBA and the AIA is doing, because it's true. Architects are so well placed and pivotal in creating the future that we need, because we are the creators of stories, we are the creators of places, and we need different, better places that will enable us to live low carbon lives. And as we say in Australia, we're shovel ready to do all of this, and the benefits are not just in zero emissions, they're in so many social and other opportunities. And we have such a responsibility to engage in this. So in Australia, working with colleagues across the wide sector, the Institute of Architects has made decarbonising our construction industry by 2030 our focus. This includes a range of initiatives. Firstly, we looked at ourselves and we've gone carbon neutral in our own operations and secured architects' commitments to do the same for their own practices and their projects. We've introduced new standards of competency for architects that include zero carbon design, and also acknowledge the importance of our Indigenous wisdom and the opportunity of incorporating this into our work, which I think is a really important thing to do, to acknowledge that zero carbon isn't the main aim. It's a very important achievement, but I think there's a lot more to be achieved, as we mentioned here. And our next, we're currently advocating for net zero emission requirements in the update of the building codes. I'm not sure we're going to succeed in that in this round, but we're going to keep pressure on, and if not at a national level, we'll be advocating for that, for the states to uptake that, or the local councils, because every single tonne counts, and if we can do net zero, if we can do zero operation buildings right now, why wouldn't you? And our next task is to develop a new Australian standard for zero carbon buildings, working with the European and other standards, but we just need to be able to make sure that there's a consistent language there. We're also developing a design policy which is based very heavily on our 2030 Design Excellence Framework. Thank you, 2030, for that. We're working with our First Nations Advisory Group to ensure their nature-centred focus is embedded within that, because there's no point in having separate policy documents, because we are a holistic design approach. So design excellence will holistically consider how to design with country in ways that realise the potential of the systems and projects the projects are set within, while providing comfortable, beautiful places and buildings that use a sufficient amount of resources and are zero emissions. So I think that it's, if not these emissions, what emissions? And if they are the most cost effective with so many social and side benefits, it would be almost criminal for architects not to help make that happen, because it really does count, and it really does count now. And I think that we are incredibly well placed to realise, to not just try and jam what we've been doing into a new reality, but to actually realise the opportunity of that new reality in really exciting and joyful ways. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. And having you here from literally the other side of the world really helps us realize just, this is a global challenge, and it's taking our global effort and cooperation to move things forward. And last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Kachikornvarakom, who is from the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Kachikorn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I'm very proud to be part of Architect 2030s, and as we are landscape architects, considering as part of architecture realms. In my words, in my Thai language, we call landscape architecture as Phumi Sathapanik, which means the architects of the earth. And I think this is a really urgent call for us as a profession and as our allies to really give this message direct to the COP26, to all the leaders, to all the top-down people who are in this event, to really ramp up the national determination contribution to be within 1.5 degrees Celsius of carbon budget. Why this thing is so important? What if we go beyond 1.5? That's going to be including my hometown, Bangkok, many islands, countries, and many delta cities, big cities like Bangkok, New Orleans, Penang, Manila, and many other cities around the world will probably be confronting with more serious consequence of that. And many of the countries will put to be out from the map. So I think this is so important for us to be here together as I represent the IFLA, International Federation of Landscape Architects today. We have over 70,000 landscape around the world from 77 of all the nations around the world here with me to actually being aligned with all our friends to commit to our projects, to our work, our action for the net zero emission in 2040. And as nature-based solution is such a key word for this COP26, I think that is our duty as a landscape architects to really be part of the solution, because our material is trees, is water, is retention ponds, it's the walkway, and many other more that can be part of the solution for the urban setting. As we know that 75% of the greenhouse gas emission is coming from the urban setting, and it's actually really important for us to change the way we use the materials, the way we finding a new solution, and the way we process our construction to really build a better world as we commit today. And I think that as 2050, that 70% of the world population will move into the urban setting. This is so much urgent for us as be part of the problems to be part of the solution right now. And for us, this past 2 years, landscape architects around the world has produced more than 3,000 projects that really helping with the carbon emissions and actually absorb more carbon than its emissions. And we continue to do that more. Within these past 2 years, we actually plant more than 1.6 billion trees. And I think that's kind of like we planning a future of the city. And as we landscape today, we actually commit, the eFlower has just launched the eFlower climate change commitment, which first we will help with all the projects and move the world faster to meet the UN SDG to actually achieve more than just one aspect of it, but to include more goals as much as possible. Second, the resilient city. I think this is so important for the city that's confronting with flooding, with drought, and with many ongoing. The seasonal change become disaster. And how could we reclaim all those resiliencies and nature-based solutions back to the city? The climate justice is actually part of our work. We work closely to make sure that in the process of design and in the user that we serve, is actually we moving toward the more equity world. And for the pandemic, the well-being, the public space is actually become the part of the public health. And I think as a landscape architects around the world, the eFlower commit to really enhance that biodiversity of the city and of the society. And working with vulnerable community is so important because we don't want to leave anyone behind. Those indigenous people from all the nation is part of our process. So I'm here today with our allies and with 70,000 landscape around the world to actually calling up all the leaders and actually really ramp up your NDC to actually help us achieve. If professionals can do this, I'm sure that the nation can do even more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kachikorn. It's really powerful words, and it's so important to have you here representing the landscape architecture dimension. I have to say that over the last couple of years, I feel like for me personally, the view of the world brought in by the landscape architects that have participated in us preparing for COP26 have really enlightened me in ways that were really helpful. Now I'm going to switch to me and talk about my involvement with the Climate Heritage Network and bringing the Climate Heritage Network into being a signator of the COP26 1.5 degrees Celsius Communiqué. A lot of what's happening here at COP26 are conversations about what has evolved since COP21 in Paris in 2015. And I think that the CHN's involvement here in COP and here as a signatory of the communique is a really important indicator of how far the world has moved. And it hasn't just moved, but I would say advanced since Paris. The Climate Heritage Network is kind of a network of networks of arts and culture and heritage organizations from every level of society, including governments, and bringing the concerns and voices of the extremely diverse world that we occupy together in just actually an incredibly compact group exercise. I would also just point out that very well represented at CHN are the voices of indigenous peoples from around the world. And as we look at climate justice issues, we're beginning to hear the voices and understand the stories of the people who are actually the most vulnerable to what the consequences of this warming planet really mean. The Climate Heritage Network represents many different dimensions of heritage concern, including built heritage. And I can say as one of the sort of designated built heritage representatives on the CHN, in some ways we're kind of outliers. Our heritage is sure big and made of stone and lasts a long time, and it's a very durable kind of heritage, and yet it is as threatened as the much more ephemeral types of heritage that others have brought to the organization and concerns. And I think for us as stewards of the built environment, that's maybe one of the places that we really need to start, is recognizing that our world is threatened by climate change. It's not others, it's also us. The one other aspect of the built heritage involvement in the Climate Heritage Network and really bringing us to signing the communiqué is understanding that most heritage buildings are living buildings. They're occupied buildings. They're literally part of the problem. They are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions today. So therefore, they need to be part of the solution. And the skill sets that we have developed in the heritage field really help us understand what appropriate and effective interventions are. And that's not a simple equation to solve appropriately. And we're really committed to being part of climate action to help avoid maladaptations and really have effective adaptations that will meet the Paris goals and really meet the decarbonization program, and yet not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I would just close by saying that something that I feel like we've learned in the engagement that we've had here at COP is that the importance of arts and culture and heritage in these conversations is enormous. It's a multiplier. It helps us understand that multiple voices are important and can be heard together, and that there are many, many perspectives, all of which are important really to achieving these decarbonization goals. So here I am with us representing both Architecture 2030 and the Climate Heritage Network, and we're really happy to have signed on to the communiqué, and I think bringing our voice to an area that not a lot of people expected us to be at. So we actually have a little bit of time left in our session, and I'd like to just go ahead and do a little Q&A and just give our panelists an opportunity to add a couple more thoughts. Let me just start by saying, well, we're kind of getting close to the end here. We've only got a couple more days of COP. Many of us have been here for several days, if not a couple of weeks, involved in this. What came across your view that surprised you and really makes you hopeful about the momentum behind COP26? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I can start, Carl. I think one of the things that we've been very focused in this moment and this conversation on what we're doing in the built environment, but I think holistically looking at our partners in finance, in so many other areas. We've heard so much in the last few days about circular economies, obviously the role of government and policy. I think this is a really great watershed moment for us to participate and collaborate with partners just beyond our own field.
So, Kachikorn, I see you leaning forward, way down at the other end of the table. I have a feeling you wanted to say something.
Yes, actually, I really have a chance to be with a negotiator from my country and really learn the process. And I just feel that I'm very hopeful because we are here together as an Architect 2030. But as a process of negotiation, for me, I feel hopeless because I feel that it's so slow. Like people arguing about using should or could, or thinking about all this terminology, but actually what we need is actually the real action that like us doing on ground. So I just feel that I'm so hopeful with Architect 2030, and I hope that the process of COP is actually move the world faster than it is right now. So, yes.
Carolyn?
It has been an amazing thing. I've never been to a COP before, and I can't believe how many tens of thousands of people are wandering the halls and probably trying to do good, except for maybe the fossil fuel lobbyists and members of our Australian government. But I think that it's that there is a willingness there, and I think the slowness is bringing everyone along together, and that it's kind of important. But leadership doesn't follow. Leadership doesn't ask for permission to do what needs to happen. And I just think it's time that every single person out there says, you know what, I'm a leader. I can step up and I can do this, and I do not need to ask permission to do the right thing right now. And I just think that particularly architects and landscape architects and everyone and mechanical engineers, everyone should be just going, gosh, I am part of the solution here. I can do this, and how can I connect with others? I heard this beautiful analogy the other day that apparently sea otters, when a big storm is coming, they go down into the water, they find a kelp, and they hold on to it with their friends, and they hold on to it together and get through that storm. And I think that not only do we need to we need to mend to create those strong connections and relationships, not only for weathering the storm, but for when we're coming up and showing leadership and doing the right thing, regardless of what our governments do.
Ginger?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that I've taken away from this experience, because I've not been to a COP either, is the energy here and the energy that we're seeing all around the world. And I can't recall in the past so much interest, at least in our country, on a COP event, but it has really exploded with this event, and it needed to. It needed to probably do it several years ago, but now it's finally gaining so much momentum. And just the energy here in the room, learning what industry is doing, what they're proposing to do, what governments are doing, what they're proposing to do, learning about methane and everything else. This is out of my area of expertise, but learning what all of this means has been a real eye-opening experience for me.
Alan, you want to share a thought?
Yeah, well, I've been to UN congresses before, although this is the first COP, but I mean, reflecting on my own experience, it's great to see countries coming together. There are so many people here, so much passion, so much positivity. And we've had some great meetings as our organisation with UK government ministers and others organisations. And for 2 weeks, the eyes of the world are on Glasgow and what's happening here. The challenge is when the fences come down and everybody leaves, what actually starts to happen. So taking all of this positivity but making something happen on Saturday and the day after and the day after for a long period is the key challenge, I think. We're all up for it, but that's going to require a big push, and we haven't seen that's going to happen just yet.
Yeah, and one of the perspectives that I have from being involved in the building sector here is that there are other sectors that have much more difficult challenges to figure out what to do next. I think the thing for the building sector that's so quite exceptional is that we have a very good idea about what the problems are, and we have a very good idea about what the solutions are. We even have a pretty good idea about what the resources are that we'll draw on to achieve them. So in this world of do what you can do, right at the top of the list is what the building sector can do and can do now. Peter talked about how, he can go back to his office and design net zero buildings. I think if you look at what the technological challenges are and what the know-how challenges are, and for that matter, what the sort of inherent characteristics are of most of the building stock, there's really hardly a building out there that can't be a net zero energy building with what we know now and the capabilities that we have now. I think the world is looking to us in our sector as a very well-educated, very well-resourced key field that really needs to lead here with our action and to start really, achieving the things that we're capable of achieving.
And I think it's not just the buildings, it's actually the whole way they connect people that we need to work to help concentrate on improving. Bringing the landscaping in, but bringing that whole sense of our connection to nature, our love of nature, because without that love, there's been a whole lot of language this week around it's a war on climate and we've got to fight this and we've got to do this. Actually, what we've got to do is move away from that very dare I say it, patriarchal and damaging approach, and sort of think of more of a really caring and nurturing and exciting and joyful approach that will create a world that we all want to live in, that a very diverse and nurturing place for us to be in.
Amen to that, and I would just point to the importance of having people like the Climate Heritage Network here who are bringing in the voices of arts and culture to just really help us change the language. This is not a battle. This is a common goal. This is work that we have to do together, and joyful work, because we're going to make the world a better place. How's that for a goal?
Important things that many has mentioned is about the generation. I think we need to build more younger generation of designer that really understand the problems, because many of our profession, education, language still really base us in 10 years ago, but maybe the world is keep moving, changing, and more challenging and more unexpected. And I think that is really about intergeneration problems that we have to have everyone together as well. Yes.
Well, that seems like a perfect thought for us to close on. On behalf of Architecture 2030, I want to thank everyone for participating today. The effort to put together the communique had one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to bring voices together, bring us together, showing that our field can actually speak with one voice, and that the basic message that we're sending is we must go faster, and that our field is prepared to go faster and is actually accomplishing a lot already and prepared to accomplish a lot more. We can't do it alone, but we're prepared to do what we can because we can do it, and we recognize that there are people that are facing tougher challenges than we are. So Ginger, Peter, Alan, Carolyn, and Kachikorn, so thank you so much for being here today. It was a great pleasure to spend an hour with you today, and I hope everybody out there in the virtual world who joined us got a lot out of the time we spent together today. We have a little video to take us out, so thank you again for participating with us today.